Hi everyone. I just wanted to go through my brain and nervous system lecture for you, um, and just to go over what I normally would do in class. Just a few things that I normally like to clarify for everyone. So first, I wanted to just kind of mention how I tell students to visualize the brain. If you think about it in terms of your two fists together, and that's each side, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and then the corpus callosum is in the middle, and then the spinal cord comes down, which can be one of your arms or the middle. And then so it's just a good way to kind of picture how the brain is in your skull. And then the picture of the dominoes is here to depict the action potential. So when we have so neurons firing in your brain, you saw in your chapters, the neurons are communicating with each other, and there is an electrical signal that needs to go through the axon into the synapse and into the synaptic gap and into the synapse of the other neuron, right? And when we say neurons fire, what we mean is that electric signal that goes, okay? But in between, they can't just keep firing. They need to build up that electrical signal again. So I use the domino analogy to show how when the dominoes are all set up, that is the action potential when it's ready to go. And then that's resting, and then when it's ready to go, that's action potential, and then the building back up, putting all those dominoes back up, is the refractory period. So you can't fire when you're building up all the dominoes, right? So neurons have to have a time in between to kind of recharge, right? So here's another picture of the neurons as they are communicating and the synaptic gap and how this works. If you see in here, you can see these tiny little balls, and they need to fit into this space, okay? And those tiny little balls are the neurotransmitters that are communicating from one neuron to the other. And there's many different kinds of neurotransmitters, and they're all listed here, okay? The receiving neuron, the one that is getting the message, has to have receptors for those specific neurons. That means it needs to have the right shape. It's kind of like a lock and key, so it fits right in there. When we have drugs, when we add drugs to the brain, like to increase a particular neurotransmitter, such as serotonin, we might do one of two things. One is block those receptors so they can't fit in anymore. And well, that actually decreases the availability. Okay, that if you block the receptors, then it blocks the communication. We don't add serotonin. We don't put serotonin in the brain. What we do is increase the availability of it. So what happens is when each one of these spots gets filled, all that extra gets taken back up into the original neuron, okay? So what some drugs do is they block that. They stop it from going back in. So that's called a reuptake inhibitor. So it stops all of that extra from going back up into the neuron. And then once these neurotransmitters go in to the neuron, then there's room for more to go in. So that increases the amount of serotonin that is moving around in the brain. Okay? So just a quick example of how neurotransmitters work in the brain. This is a little video. Let's see if that works. That'll show you. I think it's at the end. I'll put the slideshow in so you can watch that part on your own, but I just want to show you these images. So you can see the neurotransmitters going in. always thought that was a pretty cool image. All right, so just to help you picture some of that. Okay, and then we have the lobes of the brain. This is something that's important to learn in intro psych. The frontal lobe, I say dumb judgment, and this is just ways to remember. You kind of, people do like this, like, duh, I'm so dumb, right? So frontal lobe is judgment. Judgment, we think, we plan, and we make decisions in the frontal lobe. And then the parietal lobe, pat your head, that will remind you that parietal is sensation, particularly touch. And the occipital lobe is in the back of your head, and I always like to say eyes in the back of my head, something I tell my kids, that I have eyes in the back of my head. Maybe you've heard that before too. And then the temporal lobe is auditory processing. That means it's where the part of your brain that processes auditory information. So everything that you hear is processed in the temporal lobe. So knowing the different functions of the different areas of the brain can kind of give you a clue as to, if something's not right with someone and they had a brain injury, you can determine maybe where that brain injury is. It's also like when people say your frontal lobe's not developed yet, that's the latest developing part of your brain. You think about judgment, decision making. Young people aren't as good at decision making and judgment as usually a more mature person, right? So your frontal lobe is not developed until your mid-20s typically. Okay, and then here we have, this is just a depiction of the limbic system, and again, ways to remember them. Okay, so the hippocampus is here and is implicated in memory and learning. This is how the structure of the brain that really is what is active when you're learning new things. And my way of remembering that is hippocampus. It's like a college campus, right? Hypothalamus is right here, and that regulates bodily functions like hunger, thirst, sexual desire, body temperature, and the word hypo can kind of help you remember that because it's hypothermia, right? And then the amygdala in here is what regulates emotion, in particular fear and anger, as well as memory. So I had a college roommate named Amy, and that's how I remember the amygdala, is because it started with Amy. And you could say that she was a pretty emotional person, and that kind of helped me to remember that. So it might help you too. And then again, the nervous system. I'm not sure if this is the actual one from your book. I think it might be. So it just kind of helps you see where everybody's got a nervous system, right? And then the main part of it is the central nervous system, just your brain and your spinal cord. And then the rest of it is considered the peripheral nervous system. So it's everything that goes out into the periphery from your main central nervous system. And then within the peripheral nervous system, we split into autonomic and somatic, okay? Somatic is voluntary movement, like moving your muscles, okay? Running, jumping, eating, using your hands, talking, all of that is somatic nervous system. And then the autonomic part is what deals with digestion and heart rate and things like that. And then within the autonomic nervous system, we've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So sympathetic is arousing, which is motivating. It gets you to maybe study for a test. It makes you alert and focused. It's also where fight or flight happens. So when you perceive any sort of threat, and you become heightened with your heart rate and you're ready to run or ready to fight, or you freeze up. Heart rate is higher, breathing rate is higher, etc. And then the opposite to that is parasympathetic, which is the calming part of your nervous system, and that is rest and digest. So when you are aroused with your sympathetic nervous system, your body's not really digesting. And that actually explains why people who are anxious all the time often have stomach problems, because their parasympathetic nervous system is not active enough to have those internal organs working, those digestive organs working properly. Okay, so just a quick, brief overview. I know longer videos can be painful, so 10 minutes is pretty much my max. And I hope this was helpful in at least outlining some of the concepts in this chapter.